In American classical music, Virgil Thomson is often thought of as a composer who was almost eclipsed by his influence as a critic. A Kansas native who studied in Paris and came to roost in New York, Thomson also has some connections with the Boston area. And so does our guest, the producer of a compilation of vocal and instrumental works just reissued by the Virgil Thomson Foundation. We'd like to welcome the chief classical music critic with the New York Times, previously with the Boston Globe, Anthony Tommasini. Thank you very much for being with us, Anthony.
My pleasure. It's great to talk.
I want to have you go back to when you were in Boston and studying at Boston University. You were not exactly on the path to being a journalist at the time. You were trying to be a musician, and I guess that was when you discovered the music of Thompson, or maybe even before that. What was so special about this music?
Yes, I had gone to Yale and the Yale School of Music. Then I came to Boston to go to Boston University to do my Doctor of Musical Arts and Performance. And then while I was doing my degree, I got a job at Emerson College teaching music. And my colleague there, Scott Wheeler, who's a composer, we were hired the same year, knew Thompson very well and had studied with him. And it was really through Scott that I got involved with Thompson and his music. And I wound up doing my dissertation for Boston University on Thompson's musical portraits, these kind of quirky, funny pieces. He wrote almost 160 of them over his whole life. And then that got published. And it was partly that work that got me writing and turned me in the direction of going into writing as a critic.
Musical portraits, a lot of composers do these. But Thompson had a special way of doing it. It was almost methodical. Can you tell us what that was?
Yes, there were composers like Couperin and Schumann, and Elgar's Enigma Variations are a series of portraits. So but Virgil was influenced by that. But there were two things that set him off on this almost obsession of writing these portraits. One was his friend. He was in Paris in the 20s, in the late 20s. And one was his friendship with Gertrude Stein, the writer. And she was in the habit of doing verbal portraits of friends and people she knew. But she did them in a very spontaneous manner. She would sit down and sort of channel the person and work in a concentrated block of time to try to maximize the spontaneity. And Virgil was very interested in spontaneity. He thought that a lot of artists and composers had lost their knack at it. And so that influenced him. And he decided to try that in music. And he did a series of like a half a dozen solo violin portraits. And he liked the spontaneity of it. He felt that they were coming out in a very fresh, kind of quirky way. But then he was also hanging around with all these painters in Paris who were doing portraits all the time, of course, of people. And he thought, let me take it one step further. And he mimicked their method of having sitters, as he called his subjects, come sit for him in his presence. And he was very serious about this, that was essential to the portrait. Now, it wasn't exactly what the subject looked like that was being portrayed. It was just the kind of aura, the presence, the vibes coming. So the person having the portrait done could read a book. You could even go to sleep, but the only thing you couldn't do was talk to him, because he couldn't write music while he was talking to somebody. But and once he stumbled on that idea, he stuck to it, and all the portraits were done in the presence of the sitters, and it helped. And most of them came out kind of short, maybe less than a couple minutes, 90 seconds. But and they were mostly done in short sessions that usually didn't last more than 90 minutes. But there are a couple that are longer. That were done over a few sessions. But yeah, he was very devoted to the idea that they really were portraits, and that they came out so differently. And so sometimes kind of quirkily, that was his evidence that they really were not coming from him exactly. They were coming from the subjects.
Speaking of coming out differently, Virgil Thomson did a portrait of you. Yes. Sounds kind of deliberative, maybe. And Scott Wheeler did a portrait of you, and you're more easygoing. I mean, what's going on there?
It's a very interesting story. I was already working on my biography of Virgil, and it was 1984, and I was going over to the Chelsea Hotel in New York where he lived to get my portrait done. And I meant to bring a book, and I forgot to bring it. So I stopped at a newsstand, and I picked up Newsweek. And the cover story, it was in the middle of the 1984 presidential campaign. And I'm a big Democrat, and I was a big Mondale supporter, and I loved Geraldine Ferrara. And so I come and I sit down with Virgil, and he starts doing my portrait. And it starts out as this kind of lyrical Italianate sort of thing, but quickly it turns thick and dark with these massive, clashing, angry chords. And I realized that as I was reading, the cover story of Newsweek was about how Ferrara had gotten in trouble because of her husband's finances. And even now talking about it, I get my righteous liberal indignation comes back. And I was so angry at the way I thought, an unfair way she was being treated. And I think as I read that article, it came through to Virgil. And he really caught my kind of, righteous sense of injustice. It's kind of funny. He was surprised that it came out the way it came out. But that's his evidence and mine that he really was responding in the moment to what I was feeling.
When I consider the ingredients in his music, this is somebody who got into Harvard because of a connection to the Church of Latter-day Saints. And he ends up being the kind of person you'd go to if you wanted a room in the Chelsea Hotel, this hotbed of Bohemia. I mean, how do you get that in one person?
Harvard, he was all that. He was a Kansas City native and very proud to have come from, singing hymns in the Baptist church, which he never much took to, but he liked the music. And then he became a church organist in Kansas City. And when he went to Harvard, he befriended kind of bohemian type people, including Professor S. Foster Damon, a young English professor, who was a big devotee of Gertrude Stein, and he really turned Virgil on to Stein. And Virgil, he did everything. He had these bohemian friends, and yet he was in the Harvard Glee Club and was devoted to the Harvard Glee Club and wrote pieces for the Harvard Glee Club. And then he studied music and composition very seriously. So all of those different elements of his life were bouncing around already during his Harvard days. But after Harvard, he pretty much figured, no, next step is Paris. He got a traveling scholarship during one of his semesters to go to Paris. And then afterwards he went back. He had a famous line that's quoted a lot. And he said that, well, I figured if I was going to be a starving artist, I might as well starve in a city where the food was good. So he went to Paris.
Well, when I was going through some of the tracks for this double album, I also moved away from thinking of Thompson as a figure in the past to someone who was at least reaching farther into the future, almost like a precursor of minimalism and Philip Glass. How did that come about?
Yeah, you're onto something that I agree with. I wouldn't, the minimalism, not in the sense of elements of music being repeated. Repetition wasn't part of his aesthetic or language at all. But the directness, the simplicity, the idea that he thought music had gotten too pompous, too complicated, too dissonance saturated, although he could certainly write dissonance saturated pieces when he wanted to. And he wanted to simplify, to be more direct, more radically direct in a way. When Virgil's pieces, and in that sense, he did prefigure if you group Glass with the kind of postmodern, group of composers who came after the really thorny modernists and more in the middle of the century. Philip Glass told me that when he and Robert Wilson were coming up with a new way to do opera, the only model they had were the two Gertrude Stein, Virgil Thomson operas, Four Saints and Three Acts and The Mother of Us All. And so in that sense, he he was a kind of precursor to that, but not the repetition thing. No, not that. But other elements of it, yes. And also Virgil in Paris got very swept up with Dada, you know, the artistic movement. And one of the things about Dada was the bold, almost deliberate juxtaposition of things that didn't seem to go together. And Virgil loved doing that in the symphony on a hymn tune or even with some of the portraits, to juxtapose something that sounded like an evocation of a Baptist hymn, you know, with something that sounded like austere medieval counterpoint to some papa waltz, to some imbecile kind of, you know, thing that happens. He loved doing that. And I think he got that from Dada. It sort of empowered him. Go ahead, follow your.
Well, you described his music and even what he didn't like in some other people's music. What does that mean about writing, and what you learned from him about writing?
About writing, yes. Well, the thing about music is that it's very difficult to describe music in words, to describe sound in words. The only language that we have that really describes it, maybe that's what we love about music, it's the one thing you can't describe in words, you know, but the only language we have is theoretical, that uses all this jargon like chromatic harmony or, you know, a counterpoint or things like that. And even many people who love music and listen to a lot don't know the inner workings of music, don't read music. I often say I envy sports writers. Like the average crowd at Yankee Stadium knows a whole lot more about baseball and the statistics and history than the average audience at the New York Philharmonic. And people who write about sports can assume so much knowledge on the part of their readers. If you're writing about a Yankees game, you wouldn't think of explaining what the designated hitter rule is. Your readers would think, what do you think, I'm an idiot? You know, but Virgil was absolutely the best critic ever at figuring out how to describe sound, describe music in the most everyday, homespun, colloquial language. No one, even if you disagree with his take on something, or you find it driven by an agenda or whatever, everyone has to acknowledge, boy, he just could come up with the most descriptive ways to do that. When I was in Boston and teaching, I didn't get tenure at Emerson College. That's another whole story. And I started writing for the Boston Globe. They tried me out as a critic in 1985, 86 as a freelancer. And Virgil was delighted. And he took me under wing for 2 years. It was very interesting, the method. He didn't interfere. He didn't want to get involved when I was writing something. But after it was published in the Globe, I would Xerox it. And I sent them to him. And periodically, I reported to the Chelsea Hotel for the postmortems. He had red penciled them all. And for a couple of years, he really put me through the paces. You know, he really challenged my phrasing, my wording, and I learned. So it was just an incredible education. And
I want to come back to the recording because you know, these are being re-released. They were a labor of love for you the first time around, I'm sure, and you were also a performer on this. But does anything feel different with a re-release now?
Yeah, with both the Portrait album, which is all instrumental, came out in '90, and then the vocal music record, which I love, came out in '94. And for both, I got they were funded partially by grants from the National Endowment for the Arts, which at the time had a program to bring to light American music that had been overlooked. You know, and boy, both those albums had tons of music that was very much overlooked. So I'm delighted to have them back, because I think that music is still not known as well as it should be. I think people who pick up this album, or now you can go online digitally to hear it too, I think we're going to be amazed at especially some of the songs and the vocal pieces and the wonderful, quirky, inventive portraits. There are all sorts of piano pieces that I'm sure a lot of pianists don't know. So I'm delighted to bring this music to attention again. It feels like it does it goes back to another period of my life and my career, but it brings me back to those days, and it does revive my pride in playing a role in getting this music out there. You know, I think those albums did fulfill that National Endowment mission of bringing to attention important, deserving music that has been overlooked for whatever reason.
Well, thank you very much for sharing the reflections and the history. And we'd like to also thank you for taking the time to join us.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it very much.
Yeah,
Thanks.
it was Anthony Tommasini from the New York Times.